All right. Good evening, and welcome to the Will Miller Social Justice Lecture Series. My name is Pablo Bose. I'm the Director of Global and Regional Studies here at UVM. I thank you all for coming to tonight's talk by Vijay Prashad entitled Western Bombs and Eastern Societies, the Destruction of Nations and Humanitarian Intervention. His lecture seems especially timely given the events of the past few days, weeks, and months, and the often grotesque, caricatured, fantastical, and incoherent ways in which we hear globalism, imperialism, and colonialism talked about today. This lecture series was created in honor of Will Miller, a social justice activist, a Vietnam veteran, and a professor of philosophy who taught at UVM for 35 years. If you did not know Will, as I did not, I would suggest going to the website set up in his name, willmiller.org, and read some of the testimonials posted by friends, family, colleagues, comrades in struggle, and countless students. These give you a sense of the many ways in which he affected those around him as he strived to make the world a better place and give one a sense of hope in the power of good people, especially in dark times. The mission of this series is to bring speakers to the UVM campus and the Burlington community to provide a continuing program of radical analysis of social, ecological, and political concerns. Over the past decade, the lecture series has brought to UVM a long list of activists, performers, and writers from across the world, including Francis Fox Piven, Sonali Kolhatkar, Jihan Giron, Michael Parenti, Clayton Thomas Muller, Hari Kondabolu, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, Gary Young, and many more. They have all, in their various ways, offered powerful critiques of systemic inequality and injustice and inspiring models for grassroots social change. We would like to thank past and present members of the board of the lecture series, including Mike Cassidy, Ron Jacobs, Fred Magdoff, Helen Scott, and Ann Peterman for helping to determine topics and speakers, as well as the many supporters who contribute to the lecture series. Please consider joining them. You can visit the table that's set up in the back to sign up on the mailing list and to make a donation to support the series as well. We also thank Ann Lipsett, Will Miller's life partner and the inspiration behind the speaker series, for keeping this important event and the legacy of his important work a vibrant part of our local community. We're also grateful to the following UVM departments for sponsoring tonight's talk, including programs in critical race and ethnic studies, global and regional studies, and Middle East studies, the departments of English and geography, and UVM's chapter of the International Socialist Organization. United Academics, UVM's faculty union, is also a generous sponsor of the lecture series, as are the Global Justice Ecology Project, and the Will Miller Green Mountain Veterans for Peace chapter and Toward Freedom. Finally, we would like to thank CCTV, local Channel 17, who film and air these lectures and rebroadcast them many times, and so make them available online and greatly expand the audience who gets to view them. We're fortunate tonight to have with us Dr. Vijay Prashad, George and Martha Kellner Chair in South Asian History and Professor of International Studies at Trinity College. Dr. Prashad is an Indian historian and journalist. He is the author of 15 books, 2 of them picked by the Village Voice as Books of the Year, as well as 9 edited volumes. He writes regularly for Frontline, The Hindu, Birgun, and Alternet, and appears regularly on the Real News Network and Democracy Now! He's the chief editor of Leftward Books. His writing covers a range of topics on colonialism, imperialism, communist histories, South Asian experiences in the US. I've used his books like The Karma of Brown Folk, Uncle Swami, Being South Asian in America, Arab Spring, Libyan Winter, and The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World in a number of my classes. His most recent books include The Death of the Nation and the Future of the Arab Revolution, No Free Left, The Futures of Indian Communism, and the co-edited volumes Land of Blue Helmets, The United Nations in the Arab World, Letters to Palestine, Writers Respond to War and Occupation, and Dispatches from the Arab Revolt. Please join me in welcoming Vijay Prashad.
Good evening. Thanks a lot. Thanks firstly to Anne for inviting me to come. I really appreciate it a lot. Nice to see Helen again. Thanks to John for driving me from Putney, Vermont. These events are very important to us. This lecture series in honor of Will Miller. John runs a lecture series in Troy, New York, which is the James Connolly Forum. Across the country, there are gatherings like this. There are places where people come together. Some of them are socialists, thank God. Some of them are anti-war activists, thank God for them. Some of them are grannies for peace. Some of them are interested in, immigrant rights work. Some of them are interested in pushing the boundaries against social suffocation. They are involved in gay and lesbian work, feminist work, etc. This is the world we live in. Yesterday there was an election. There was a guy elected president of the United States. But underneath the election, there are series like this. There are places like this where good-hearted, intelligent people gather. They think about the world they would like to live in. They think about really the crud, the deeply sedimented, disgusting, attitudes that we've inherited from the past that surround us. And they pick up the shovel. They spend a great deal of their time shoveling the crud out of their way and producing a path to the future. That's really what these lecture series are about and for. These are not places where we gather to listen to somebody, to feel, wow, we heard somebody, they said this, let's take notes, go back, we learned something. That's not what it's for. What it's for is for people to gather together, to take the measure of each other, to understand what we live for, what we fight for, why we go to picket lines, why we decide to go and stand, 6, 7 people maybe, stand in the cold with signs saying, we oppose this, we are for that, we are against this, we are in favor of that. The reason we come here is basically to, as I said, look at each other in the eye and feel very much what it is to be human. So I'm extremely happy to be here because this is a great way to feel human again. I recognize people are feeling desolate, depressed. I'm half tempted to just speak about the election. That's half of my mind says, just go right into it, talk about the election. Forget about Iraq, forget about Syria. Those places will take care of themselves. When will America take care of itself? Let's talk about America. But let's leave that aside for now. Let's remember that we are here to produce a more humane America, because a more humane America will be, in a sense, better for the world. Let's also not forget that this new dispensation, this new period that is opening up, is not so new after all. After all, Trump is the inheritor of 30 years of policies that have hollowed out this country, that have destroyed towns, that have emptied out jobs, that have made it impossible for people to imagine what it is to live in this world and under this enormous ideological cloud called America. After all, they also have been sold this bag of goods that America is the greatest place on earth, and yet they look around and say, I can't afford anything. I can't buy anything. I'm not able to live in the illusion of America sufficiently. So this is a long period of hollowing out, a long period of the destruction of this country from within by its own elites. So yes, okay, Trump, we are scared. When will that knock come at night? FBI official, we need you for questioning. Guantanamo is now empty. Perhaps we'll send some of you peace activists down there to enjoy the weather. Of course we fear that. Of course we don't know what this dispensation, shall we call it by its word, this regime, the Trump regime, we don't know what it'll look like. But one thing is clear, that this is not just about Trump or an election. This is about that process. And the political elites have all colluded in this process. They've brought the whole country here, and this is where it has been delivered. That I don't say that with any satisfaction. I say that with a great deal of grief. But we are here now. Let's remember that many people here have fought for decades to make things better. This is hardly a surprise to us. The fight is on and engaged, and we'll see them on the streets. Shall we move to Iraq now? Okay. It's a funny business. Well. Now I'll start crying. Now it'll be my turn to cry. So, it's a funny business. we don't want to think about this really very much. But in 1991, when the United States started bombing Iraq, to attack, in a sense, the hardened areas of Saddam Hussein in Baghdad, Saddam Hussein was sitting inside one of his palaces with his culture minister Hamdan. And Hamdan, who was one of the most intelligent people in the Saddam inner circle, said something very interesting. And by the way, we know this because Saddam Hussein, mindful of posterity, just like Richard Nixon, taped all his conversations. And you can actually go and listen to the tapes if you have Arabic in Rice University. There's an archive where you can listen to all the Saddam tapes. And in this particular tape, Hamdan turns to the circle of advisors and says, "Where is the Soviet Union? Where is the Soviet Union?" When I heard that line, I thought, wow, they understood something important. And I'd like to begin here. Where is the Soviet Union? In 1989, when the United States went to war against Panama, some people here may remember it, and others should go and watch a terrific documentary called The Panama Deception. If you haven't seen it, if you're a young person, don't know anything about the war in Panama, I really recommend you have film screening of Panama Deception on campus. It's an incredible video. It won the Oscar, actually, stunningly, I think maybe 91 or 92. When the United States went to war against Panama in 89, it was an unheard of type of invasion. Massive aerial barrage against the country. Special forces jump in, they seize the sitting president, and they bring him back to Florida. Now, the United States has done all kinds of covert operations, and some overt, for decades before this, overthrowing governments, Arbenz, Guatemala, 54, 53, Mossadegh, Iran. This was known, this world of covert operations against the world. It was also known that the United States would go in heavy, big, into countries. Vietnam, for instance, from the 1950s to 1975. But that was an overt war where they fought on the ground, a ground battle. It was also clear that the United States would use proxy wars, such as, for instance, in Latin America, using Honduras as the lily pad, destabilizing Guatemala, destabilizing El Salvador, destabilizing Nicaragua. This was their MO. It was known. But there was something new about Panama. Massive aerial bombardment, special forces going in, very few forces on the ground, grabbing a leader, disappearing. Regime change. And nobody said anything. The next year, Saddam Hussein, under very poor assessment of what US Ambassador April Glaspie said to him in the summer of 1990, decided to enter Kuwait. And we can talk about why he did this later. It doesn't matter really. 91, huge troop deployment into Saudi Arabia, massive bombardment of Iraq. Again, huge bombardment, devastating bombardment of Iraq, and then attempted overthrow which failed, step back. Then Yugoslavia, 1999, massive bombardment. Again, regime change. Nobody said anything. United Nations began to sound as if it didn't quite understand what the Americans were doing. Occasional muffled critique in the General Assembly. No critique in the horseshoe table of the Security Council. The Russian vote had gone to sleep. Now, it helped, of course, that Yeltsin was a drunk and eager to become basically, the offshore agent of the United States in Eurasia. That was what he had hoped to turn Russia into, another province of the United States. He was quite open about that. But there was no criticism from the Russians, and the Chinese had turned inward because they had now changed their mode of essentially generating accumulation. After 1989 to 92, the Chinese had developed this enormous engine in free trade areas like Shenzhen, and they decided not to at all criticize the United States. They went to sleep. This was the opening of the era of unipolarity. The State Department in the 1950s had wanted to start a project which they called the project of creating preponderant power. That is, the United States would have the ability to strike anywhere in the world at any time and be the only world power to do so, and to make sure its rivals were not able to come up. That was the strategy from the 1950s, when the very repellent Dulles brothers were in charge of the CIA and the State Department, Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles. You know, the sad thing about Washington, D.C. is that the two airports in that town are named for Dulles and Reagan. I mean, you know, if you want to start a petition of something in this age of Trump, you might want to suggest that one of the airports should be named for at least somebody who's half decent. You know, at least one of them. You can say to the Republicans, you can take one of them. Can't have both. You know, I sometimes decide which airport should I go into, which is worse or better. So this idea of preponderant power was impossible in the 60s, 70s, 80s, partly because the Soviet Union was a counterbalancing force and partly because the Third World had, to some extent, created a bloc in the non-aligned movement, etc., through the United Nations to at least make some kind of moralistic condemnation of American power. By 1989, 1991, those fetters were gone. And the United States found nobody able to militarily or want to militarily challenge US power, and there was certainly nobody in the United Nations willing to moralistically condemn what was going on. So from about 1990 to the mid-2000s, the United States had this period of untrammeled domination. Nobody could stop whatever agenda you wanted to put through. The test of this, essentially, was Iraq in 2003. I mean, I don't know, many of you probably marched against that war. I was in New York City on February 15th, 2003. There must have been over 1 million people marching the streets, saying, if you attack Iraq, you're going to mess that whole region up. By the way, I'm sorry to say, there are many things I might say that will sound sanctimonious. Like, I told you. But I don't mean that, because I hate the fact that these outcomes are so miserable. I know these regions. I've traveled in them. I have friends there. It brings me no joy to say that the United States and NATO destroyed Libya. It brings me no joy. It brings me no joy to say that in 2011, when I was saying this is a really terrible idea, and almost everybody on the left was saying, you've got to support the overthrow of Gaddafi, it brings me no joy to say that one of my favorite countries in the world is a ruin now. And I'll come back to Libya in a second. So I might sound like I'm enjoying this. I'm not enjoying it at all. When the war against Iraq was being pushed, the UN at the time had developed essentially some sentiment of, let's say, guts. The year after the war began, the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan called it an illegal war, but not during the lead up to the war. Nonetheless, many of the powers said this is not a good idea. They agreed with the 1 million people protesting on the streets of New York. And by the way, we were not taking instructions from Vladimir Putin. We were there of our own volition. We understood this was a nightmarish scenario. Despite the fact that there was no UN resolution supporting the false and illegal American war, where Colin Powell later and his advisor, his chief of staff, Larry Wilkerson, later will admit that they had been deliberately lied to. They had been deliberately lied to. Colin Powell had told the CIA, I am not going to use the material in the speech you've given me at the UN. And then the CIA director, in the last minute, grabbed Colin Powell and said, put it back because we have new information. He said, we have an informer telling us that there's a link between Saddam and Al-Qaeda. We have new information. Later, Larry Wilkerson, that is Colin Powell's chief of staff, said that the so-called new information they were given had been taken under torture. Sheikh al-Libby was held in an Egyptian prison when Mubarak was in power, had been tortured, and by the way, as if this is, mitigating, there were no Americans in the room, he says. Meaning he couldn't verify the information. A few weeks after Libby said this to the Egyptian captors, interrogators, he recanted. He said, I only said it because I was waterboarded. But this information was not given to Powell. Now, I'm not carrying water for Colin Powell. I'm just using this as a point to say they deliberately lied to people in their own administration. They deliberately lied to go to that war. Nobody has been prosecuted for that illegal war. Nobody. We are so quick to say, let's go and throw out the illegal dictator Assad. Let's go and destroy the illegal dictator Gaddafi. Let's go and overthrow the illegal this, brutal dictator that. So easy. It flows off our lips like honey coming out of a flower. Let's go overthrow that evil dictator. How many of you have been on the streets, said, Let's bring George W. Bush to justice for an illegal war where millions of people have been killed. Forget 500,000 killed. They have slaughtered their own people in Syria. You know, I've heard this argument. It is a sanctimonious argument. Unless those same people are out there fighting for justice for the people in Iraq, where almost every household has lost one person, millions of people killed by this regime, by the Bush administration, which, as I said, lied not only to the American people, but to its own administration. And we don't insist that they are a murderous, barbarous regime. We'll say, oh, Mubarak, oh, kings of Saudi Arabia, oh, over there. Hello, look to your own house. Look to your own house. Look to your own leader. Look to your own regime. This regime is as culpable as any other. In 2003, when they went to war in Iraq and overthrew Saddam's government, that set off in motion one of the saddest Cold Wars, regional Cold Wars in West Asia. Imagine this. You are the American government. You are George Bush's administration. You're sitting in a security meeting. 9/11 has occurred. You say, let's knock out the Taliban in Afghanistan. Let's knock out Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party in Iraq. Not one person, it seems to me, I interviewed people in these meetings, not one person, it seems to me, from what I've learned, said, wait a minute, friends, let's game theory this through. Anybody learn game theory? Kind of silly form of political science, honestly. I'm sorry to insult anybody about this, but you know, come on, let's face it, pals. People are not so rational. Rational choice, I mean, hello. Then we say people vote against their interests, you know, as if that excuses. Now, rational choice can remain untouched. They vote against their interest. People are not rational. They are moved by all kinds of peculiar emotions. Nobody said, listen, friends, Taliban, Saddam, these are the two historical enemies of Iran. If we, the Americans, get rid of the Taliban, on Iran's eastern frontier, their enemy has been taken out. If we take out Saddam from the western frontier of Iran, Iran's western enemy is gone. They fought a brutal war from 1980 to 88 when the Iraqis used Western-provided chemical weapons against the Iranians. Iranians didn't retaliate. Interesting, Ayatollah Khomeini, the devil, published a fatwa, not against Salman Rushdie, not this one. He published a fatwa in which he forbade the Iranian government to retaliate with chemical weapons. He said this is un-Islamic. So, you know, when you have a debate about Iran and nuclear weapons, it might be a good idea to pull out that fatwa and say, but, you know, this is still an operating fatwa in Iran, meaning they still are under Khomeini's injunction, no weapons of mass destruction. Might be interesting for reasonable, rational people to read things like this, to understand from within that government what is their thinking. Might be useful. Let's knock out the Taliban. Let's knock out Baghdad, Ba'ath from this side. So now Iran suddenly can flap its wings on each side, whether it's into Afghanistan, when Ismail Khan of Herat, who had taken refuge inside Afghanistan, enters Kabul alongside Hamid Karzai to bring Iran's influence into the government of Afghanistan. On the other side, the Dawa party, led by Nouri al-Maliki, they enter from exile, and Iran's influence grows in Baghdad. Now suddenly they are thinking, how did this happen? How did Iran suddenly get powerful in the region? This is outrageous. We have to put Iran back to its borders. What do? Several things. First, the US Congress passes the Syria Accountability Act, 2003, right after they've committed this illegal war in Iraq. Syria Accountability Act. What does this mean? This means that Syria has to break its links to Iran. Now, why would Syria break its link to Iran? It's profitable for Syria to have a link with Iran. Syria provided, by the way, Damascus airport, where Iranian planes landed with weaponry that went by truck across the border to the Lebanese militia Hezbollah. Why should Syria not refuse Iranian payments for providing this pathway to Hezbollah? Second, United States green lights Israel's war against Lebanon in 2006. Very brutal bombing of Beirut. Israel did not succeed. Hezbollah remained standing. It made Hassan Nasrallah, leader of Hezbollah, an Arab hero at the time. That didn't succeed. Syria Accountability Act didn't succeed. Israeli war against Lebanon didn't succeed. Number three, suddenly, out of nowhere, the United States decided, with Israeli help, that Iran has a nuclear program. And the nuclear program must end. Now, they never told you, but the Iranian nuclear program was set up by who? Not the Shah as such. Could the Shah have just set up a nuclear program? Do you think the Peacock Throne dwellers understood nuclear physics? Who made their nuclear program? The United States government, through the Atoms for Peace program. Correct. The United States government helped the Iranians develop a nuclear program. And then when the revolution took place in Iran in 79, the United States government said, no more nuclear program. It went dormant for many years while there was great turbulence inside Iran. And then the Iranian government said, we'll start our nuclear program. But we are committed only to Atoms for Peace. Now, I'll just give you a slight detour. This might be bizarre, but it's a slight detour. I come from India. India has never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. You know this treaty? It's supposed to freeze nuclear proliferation in the world. It hasn't worked at all. United States is going to spend trillions of dollars upgrading their nuclear weapons because they might have to fight the alien invasion. So this is very important. In case aliens come to abduct me, I've been waiting for years. I've been telling people that, any day they want to take me, I'm ready. But they have to take my children with me. And the food has to be good. That's the minimum requirement. If the food is bad, I'm not interested. I'm not interested in injecting food. I like eating. So that's not going to happen. So nuclear non-proliferation treaty, not a very good treaty. Nonetheless, India refused to sign it. In 1974, India exploded nuclear bombs. Then, if that was not enough, in 1998, India exploded nuclear bombs again. So India has twice tested nuclear bombs. Plus, India says, we are not interested in the non-proliferation treaty. That's India. Then there's Iran. Iran is a member of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Iran has never tested nuclear bombs. Strange. Condoleezza Rice in 2004 goes to India right after this attempt. Now, how to squeeze Iran? She says to the Indian government, we know you're bad, but we want to have a nuclear agreement with you, the so-called US-India nuclear agreement. We're going to provide you with nuclear material. We know that you want to make bombs, but that's okay. We want Westinghouse to sell you nuclear reactors. So we're going to bring you out from the cold, diplomatic cold. We're going to provide nuclear material, but you have to go to the International Atomic Energy Agency, where stunningly India had a seat at the table that year, and you have to vote against Iran. India is a nuclear scofflaw. It's illegal nuclear weapons program. United States tells India, go vote against Iran, which is a member of the NPT, which has UN inspectors inside the country, IAEA inspectors, which has not got a nuclear weapons program, but may, remember Netanyahu with the line, may at some future time with this Bugs Bunny thing, might at some future time have a program, but India does have a program, is illegal. Now India is being told, we're going to give you status as a nuclear power, illegal, but we'll bring you in if you vote against Iran. So all these countries were suborned in the 2000s to squeeze Iran. That was the third attempt to put Iran back to its borders. But that failed. While the sanctions regime was going on from the West and from Europe, Iran was freely trading with China and India. Freely, openly trading. If you travel to Tehran, there are more Chinese construction companies operating there than you would ever imagine were possible to be in the world. If you go to Chinese cities, there are 5, 6, 10 cranes. You can measure the so-called new prosperity by the number of cranes, giant skyscraper cranes operating. In Tehran, there are many, all Chinese writing. They shipped overland. China is developing as part of the important Southern Silk Road corridor with the Chinese. It totally decided we are not interested in the sanctions regime. Now, they wanted the sanctions regime to go. I'll give you one quick story. Iran was selling India gasoline and natural gas during the sanctions period. India was paying for it in rupees. But Iran wasn't buying anything from India. So I asked the Iranian ambassador, why don't you buy things from India? It makes sense. You have a huge surplus of Indian rupees. Rupees are basically useless outside India. Why don't you buy things from India? He said, what shall we buy? He said to me. I was like, well, you can buy wheat, for instance. He said, we don't want to buy wheat. Do you know which country Iran buys wheat from? The largest exporter of wheat to Iran? United States. This country is suffocating you, and you continue to buy wheat. Why not buy it from India? They said Indian wheat is low quality. You see, this is the idea of America. America has the best products. The wheat is better than Indian wheat. I mean, come on. You know, even the Iranians, that way their brains are colonized. They want to buy from America. Sanctions regime didn't succeed. When Obama basically said, let's cut a deal with the Iranians, that was as much a sign of a draw. They couldn't do it. They couldn't overthrow the Iranian regime, couldn't put it back in its borders. The fourth episode was the Arab Spring. When the Arab Spring broke out, I remember seeing Iranian diplomats in the region saying things like, this is not an Arab Spring, it's an Islamic awakening, which began with the Islamic Revolution in Iran. They call it the Islamic Revolution. I always interrupt and say, no, it was an Iranian revolution, surely. There were communists, there were liberals, there were even monarchists involved. Surely this was Iran. He said, no, it's an Islamic revolution. So they said this is an Islamic awakening. They were jockeying for power in the region. So were the Turks. They said this is their kind of Muslim Brotherhood uprising. So were the Saudis in their own bizarre way. This is a thing we are going to control. Eventually the Saudis always win because they have petrodollars and the Americans on their side. But anyway, Iran tried to get involved in this, and once again, the push came from the forces of counter-revolution, which is the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United States, etc., to stop the Iranian advance in the region. And it turned out very tragically that the front line for that was Syria. Syria was the front line for the regional Cold War battle between Iran and the Saudi Arabia that had been brewing from the overthrow of the Saddam government in 2003. Syria has very little to do whether the Syrian people want freedom. If you believe that, you haven't understood what's going on. You haven't seen the kind of ravaged cities that you now see, and where the fight is basically between Saudi, Qatari proxies on the one side, the Syrian government, and the Iranians on the other. I'd like to read something for you, and then I'll stop and we can talk a little bit. So this is from the book I had written. It'll take me 10 minutes to read this, and then we'll talk. A small village in the upper elevations of the borderlands between Syria and Lebanon awaits the slow drop in temperature. Jabhat al-Nusra fighters, this is the Al-Qaeda group, Jabhat al-Nusra fighters who had been stuck in these upper redoubts fear the winter. They are already cut off from their supply lines and hemmed in by the Syrian and Lebanese armies, as well as by Hezbollah's fierce determination to prevent their further movement into Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. It is mid-October 2014, and alongside the road, just outside the village, sit 6 al-Nusra fighters. They are all young, in their early 20s. Each has long hair and a beard, a Jesus look that does not match the various guns that are near at hand. One of them, Muhammad, with a Kalashnikov in his lap, is Lebanese. He has a college degree and has been with al-Nusra for at least a year. Muhammad does not dispute Hezbollah's skilled ferocity. He says that the Hezbollah fighters are much more difficult to tackle than those of the Lebanese or Syrian armies. But the war has made this young man from a moderate family in the Akkar region wary. His eyes sparkle as he speaks, but there is already iron in his soul. If I had a job, he tells me, I would not do jihad. I ask him about Al-Qaeda, the parent organization of Jabhat al-Nusra. He speaks idealistically, but is not versed in scripture or in the ideological squabbles between the jihadi groups. I was trained in engineering, he says, as if in apology, when I tell him that I'm not only a journalist, but also a college professor. What gets him going is not Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra, the formal colors of his outfit. He is enamored of the battlefield successes of ISIS. Its sheer audacity impresses him. They care for nothing, not the borders or the old order. Muhammad likes this. It excites him. The war itself is relatively dull. Battles here and there threaten human lives and seem to make little progress. Fighters like Muhammad seem equal parts bored and ecstatic. No wonder the fighters take drugs, such as Captagon, which gives them what they call chemical courage and gets them out of ennui. The government of Bashar al-Assad, which the West, Turkey, and the Gulf Arabs thought would fall on several occasions, remains intact, but deeply weakened. It continues to control most of the major population centers. Despite their apathy to his government, Western journalists and diplomats feel safest in the government's realm. Fear saturates the zone of the rebels, whether the slowly depleting Free Syrian Army or the various Islamist groups, such as the Al-Qaeda affiliate Al-Nusra, the Saudi proxy Jaish al-Islam, or ISIS. Kidnappings for ransom and for spectacular killings are the threat. There is no longer any reliable force that carries the moderate banner for the West. The entrails of this war suggest little hope. Few signs of peace are visible. UN peace conferences in Geneva are either of no consequence or abandoned. Even exhaustion, which is the mood among many fighters, is not a guarantee of a ceasefire. The combatants resemble boxers in the final bouts of their championship round, blinded by pain and fatigue, groping for a target on the body of the other. Except that in this case, there are no rounds, no bells, no going the distance. In this case, there is only a war that seems to stretch till infinity. Thanks a lot. So, we have a long time. We have about 45 minutes. I've just wanted to make some suggestive remarks to give you 45 minutes for us to have a conversation. So please ask questions. Make sure you don't, attack me. I'm not your enemy. But feel free if you really need to get it off your chest. Make your questions brief so that I can think and don't get lost in the questions. So yeah, please go ahead.
I think it's clear about now, especially with the ascension of Donald Trump and his affinity with Putin, especially in the realm of the idea of multipolarity. I guess I just wondered if you could speak to that, about this closing of the age of American unipolarity, and how potentially the Trump administration, with all the contradictions in the ideology he's been trying to propagate, might interact with that.
Okay, so, affinity with Putin.
Well,
whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Let's say it's true.
Yeah.
Let's say there was a big conspiracy. Okay. So, when the Russian Air Force entered Syria, that was a very interesting moment because it's the first time since Panama 1989, and it's good you asked that question because it allows me to close the circle. Since 1989, it's the first time that the United States has been militarily blocked by another power. Now, there have been moments when the United States has tried to push against China in the South Sea lanes, and China has acted belligerently. In other words, belligerently. US ships go into near Chinese waters and the Chinese destroyers come and push back. Or there have been moments when a US destroyer leaves Qatar, a very narrow strait between Qatar and Iran. From Qatar you can see Iran, and then Iranian boats, they're basically jet skis, come flying up to the American boats and go away, and then come flying in and go in. They sometimes shoot if the American boat is here, they shoot over there, the Iranians. So there have been those military conflicts, but those are not really conflicts of consequence. Those are basically little skirmishes like ants bothering you, mosquitoes, big American destroyer and these irritating jet skis. This is real. So from maybe the end of the Iraq war period, let's say 2007, when the West went into this financial crisis, deep financial crisis, and the spillover happened around the world, from this period onward, new, and I signaled this a little bit with the Iran thing, there were new developments taking place. See, the world had become, in a global order, had become unbalanced in the late 80s. United States became seriously deluded that it was the sole power. People talked about a new American century. People talked about America as being the future of the world. You know, Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History and the Last Man. Everybody will become a liberal democracy. Deluded people. But nonetheless, it took some time for rebalancing to occur. So in this period after the Iraq war, you started to see new relationships develop. For instance, the Russians and Chinese. Now, Russians and Chinese have had a very poor relationship from the 1950s, maybe even earlier, from the Sino-Soviet split in the communist movement, but actually even earlier. But in the 2000s, you saw new engagements taking place. As the West started to, whether it's real or not, encircle Eurasia, you know, as NATO moved eastward, threatening Russia. You know, Edward Shevardnadze was told by James Baker, when the Soviets said we won't dispute the unification of Germany, Shevardnadze was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union. He said, you cannot move NATO beyond the German border. And James Baker said, we won't move it. That was an agreement they signed. But since then, NATO has crept closer and closer to Russia. So that's one piece of insecurity the Russians have felt, this NATO moving closer and closer. It's a very provocative thing to move NATO closer and closer. After all, Russia continues to be a nuclear power. On the other side, this pressure on China, you know, has been building up. And, you know, this pressure on China is not irrational. See, I'll tell you what I mean by that. In the 1980s and 90s, when US-Japanese trade deficit was against the United States, twice the US government forced Japan to renegotiate its currency. It was called the Plaza Accord of 1980 and then the Reverse Plaza Accord of 95. So twice Japan, under immense pressure from the Americans, changed their yen-dollar ratio to benefit America. You know, when they say Japan has been in a long economic slump, it's not helped them that twice they revalued their currency to benefit the United States. Why did they do that? Because they are not an independent country. They rely on the American nuclear umbrella. They rely on bases in Okinawa, etc. They are a subordinate power. China has refused to renegotiate and revalue its currency. Several times it's been demanded of China. You are illegally propping up your currency. You must have all heard this. China illegally, they say, what of it? Send Trump to renegotiate a better deal. We don't care. What can you do? So they keep pressuring them in the Chinese lanes, sea lanes. You know, spy plane flying over southern, which, you know, remember that had to land in Hainan Island, and then there was a little controversy there. So this pressure game on both sides has brought Russia and China together. That was a stupendous strategic error. Even Henry Kissinger, who miraculously is still alive. Every few months, I think, isn't he dead already? He's going to outlive all. He's not a human being. He's sucking the blood. He has a picture of himself in his attic, like, you know, Dorian Gray. You know, unbelievable. Even in his book called China, even he says this was a stupid strategic mistake to pressure these two countries. They brought them together. 2 years ago, they created a joint military alliance. When sanctions came against Russia because of the Crimea and Ukraine standoff, the Chinese said, sell your natural gas to us. So those relations are tightening. So what's happening is there's been a long period of rebalancing. When Libya happened in 2011, Russians and Chinese abstained from UN Security Council vote 1973. They said, okay, the West, you want to save civilians? We won't block you. We won't veto this. You are using the responsibility to protect doctrine to go to war in Libya. Fine, we'll allow you. Immediately after the French started bombing, because the French started bombing in Tripoli, they said, you have violated this agreement. You violated the terms of Security Council Resolution 1973. You're going for regime change. We never agreed to regime change. We agreed to protect civilians. So after that vote in March of 2011, Russians and Chinese said we're never going to allow them to go have any R2P through the Security Council. And when Russia decided to enter militarily into Damascus, it's important to remember the Chinese backed them fully. So this is an era of rebalancing. There's nothing progressive about this. You know, it's silly for progressive people to say, I'm with Putin, or I'm with the Chinese. I am with rebalancing. I think rebalancing is a very healthy development. Now, in the space of rebalancing, you build your own strength and power. You can't latch on to Putin. I don't want to support a world leader who rides on a horse without a shirt. That kind of machismo has no place in my movement. You know. But I understand the value of rebalancing. Do you see what I mean? So I support rebalancing. I think it's a very positive development for human history. But it's not that they are going to save the world. The Russians have come to save the world. Yes, sir.
Question about Pakistan. Could you put it in context the nuclear weapons in Pakistan like you did India? And do you see any hope or any solutions if you could implement them for the territorial dispute between India and Pakistan?
Now this is a huge different discussion. No, look, firstly, India has to wake up to the fact, you know, there's got to be like a ratio question. If your ratio is for every 7 civilians, you have 1 security personnel, this is no longer not an occupation. I mean, India, for every 7 people in the Kashmir Valley has 1 security person, 1 army person. That's ridiculous. So India has to rethink what's going on in Kashmir. At the same time, the Pakistanis are playing a very nefarious game. They see Kashmir as the soft underbelly for irritating India. India sees Baluchistan as the soft underbelly for irritating Pakistan. These countries need to, at some point, come to a realization nobody's winning here. You know.
I find in many cases people can find a better way of resolving.
No, I understand. I'm coming to that. It's not about politics alone. You know, it's about the class reality of who's in charge. You know, I mean, look, face it. Let me be a little crude for a minute. The dynamic of capitalism has inside it this tendency to war. Tendency to imperialism is very much there. I don't have time to work out all the details, but I'm just saying it crudely. So if you have class regimes with a certain propensity to promote capitalist forms of society and capitalist forms of production, that tendency to militarism should not be a surprise. You know, so we shouldn't say, oh, these leaders are bad. Let's elect better leaders. The system has got to be transformed. So one should not have too many, you know, I mean, there can be worse and better people running a country. You know, that I understand. The current Prime Minister of India, their regime is not good. Previous one was as bad for most things, but at least they were decent people. That's the difference between Clinton and Trump, say. It would have been whatever. She would have been pro-gay, pro-women, less angry about Muslims, ban, you know, these things. But those things are important to people's lives. They're not, you can't say these are minuscule things. But underneath that, the broad class agreement that they share is fundamental. I was reading this report by Kudrow and whatever, the 2 Trump advisors on trade. Stunningly, they think NAFTA is a good idea. These are Trump's advisors on trade. So he is saying one thing here, and his advisors are saying something else. I was joking with you in the car. It would be so funny if Trump called up Bernie Sanders and said, will you become my commerce secretary? So interesting. Because he, after all, in the debates kept saying, Bernie was right about this, Bernie was right about, why not invite him? You know how they have a Democrats have a Republican in the cabinet. Imagine if Sanders got the call. Would he take the call? For the sake of the Republic. Somebody else, please. Some students ask me questions, ridiculous. Don't let all of them ask. I'll come to you 1 second. Let me just put some pressure on students. Ask me some questions, otherwise I'm leaving. Yeah, please. Yeah.
What's your take on the South China Sea and the Philippines and the U.S. and their role in that part of the world?
Are you following the new leader in Philippines? I mean, it's a combination of both interest and I'm interested and terrified at the same time. They're just telling people, go kill drug addicts. I mean, how many people now shot? 5,000? Just, no trial, nothing, extrajudicial killing. You are deemed drug dealer, dead. Crazy. Then suddenly on the other side, he's now decided to pivot from America towards China and Russia. This is part of that rebalancing. And by the way, again, I just want to underline, it doesn't mean it's progressive. But the rebalancing, one has to see as a somewhat decent thing. If tomorrow whatever says Subic Bay Americans leave, let's say tomorrow he says you leave from Subic Bay, that actually might be a good thing. If more countries say US bases should close, that would be a good thing. It would make American foreign policy less arrogant. One of the reasons I liked reading the WikiLeaks cables, and I recommend, by the way, I don't mean the Podesta ones. Those I have mixed feelings about, because idiots at WikiLeaks released private communication. Podesta and his wife talking about domestic matters. Those should not have been released. Privacy is important to me. Whoever the person is, they shouldn't have released all that. Release the pertinent emails. Don't release everything. There was some very bad decision making. Anyway, but the State Department cables were fascinating because there were these long-standing career diplomats, like Margaret Scobie was the ambassador in Egypt. And she would send these cables saying, listen, I cannot be in these meetings because Pentagon people come and they go and meet Mubarak and I'm not even invited. You get a sense how this arrogance of militarism, bases everywhere, the ability to, means they completely sideline State Department people. These are career diplomats, a lot of them good people like Ann Wright, who resigned from the State Department during the Iraq War and is now a major peace activist. These are good-hearted people. They think they're in the diplomatic business, but actually they are setting meetings for the military fellows. They are the ones picking up the phone saying, Mr. Mubarak, Petraeus is coming, would you meet him? Their function is secretarial now. So this is important. If they say base is gone, that would be interesting. Now the South China Sea battle is significant, but it's actually, it's a ridiculous battle. Look, China is building ports in Hambantota in Sri Lanka, in Gwadar in Pakistan, in Burma there are 2 ports. China will soon not need the South China Sea. It will be able to bring natural gas through Russian pipelines. It will have goods go to Africa through Burma and Pakistan. It won't need the South China Sea. That's purely a political fight. Right now, those lanes are important for Chinese shipping, but they will soon become less important. So this is a silly game. See, what I don't understand is, if we are solid thinking people, we should come up with our own foreign policy. What is the people's foreign policy? I would like to see the people call for more grand bargains. I would like a grand bargain called for between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the United States. I'd like to say we need a grand bargain. We need a conference where these 3 powers sit together and they have a discussion. And this should be our charter, the people's charter. We should have a grand bargain with China. These are the 8 outstanding issues. This is how we, the people, want to deal with it. Make connection with people in China. There are lots of good people in China who would be happy and publicly willing to sign on to a charter like that. You understand what I'm saying? But we don't think of a people's foreign policy. We somehow think foreign policy is the business of states. We should have a foreign policy. Coming to your question, we should have a foreign policy. Let's come up with a charter of demands. Maybe in one of your classes you can say, let's do it as a combined project. All the class, in some political science class. The professor will tremble at the thought. Yes, please.
Robert Kennedy's thesis about the origin of the Syrian conflict being a pipeline, I'm sure you're familiar. Could you comment on that, the importance, the relative importance of that?
You see, the thing is that I remember during 2003, one of the big slogans was no blood for oil. And there's a habit that's developed in our movement to always see direct material interest. But the way 21st century imperialism works, it doesn't actually need to have a direct material interest. Because after all, political power is a material force. Like I was giving you the Chinese example. If the United States had more political power over China, it could force China to revalue its currency. So the control of South China Sea is not about oil, pipelines, etc. It's about political pressure. I see the Syria conflict much more about breaking Iran's role in the region than about pipelines. Now, pipelines and things may play a role. I'm not going to say it doesn't. There can be many factors involved. Different parts of the security establishment and the power elite may have different things they're interested in. You understand? But the real allergy that has developed in the power, in this force of counter-revolution in Saudi Arabia, Israel, is Iran. Iran has taken on this role. This country of maybe 80 million people has become this bogey in the region that's completely outsized its power. You know, I interviewed people from Hezbollah and I asked them, why did you enter Syria? These are ordinary Hezbollah people. And they said, well, one, to protect Lebanon from the Salafi, the jihadis. And second, because Iran told us. Very clear, open. It was a strategic interest of Iran, and Iran is a main benefactor. Fine. Why deny it? That's what is there. But that means you don't say, my God, Iran. Same fighters will say, we hate the Syrian war. We don't like it. It's not correct. You know what I'm saying? It's complicated. So this Iran bogey, I think, plays a much bigger role than strictly, it's a Facebook, Twitter problem. We'll post a picture of pipelines and say, look, this explains the war. The pipeline is to go through here. My friend Pepe Escobar does this a lot. He has a whole theory of Pipelineistan. Pipelines here, pipelines there. And I caution saying, it's not always pipelines. You are a pipeline reductionist. Somebody else. Yes.
What do you feel about the role that the Kurdish forces are playing in Syria, especially as it seems that if there's one thing that a lot of the belligerent forces in Syria and Turkey and Iraq can agree on, it's opposing the Kurds in the first place.
Correct. Very well said. So I didn't come here to sell books. I didn't bring any books. I just want to say the last chapter is on Turkey and is on the contradictions of the Kurdish struggle. So, the Kurdish people, there are some historical tragedies. The Ottoman Empire's collapse left a lot of historical tragedies. One is the genocide of the Armenians, was a historical tragedy of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The other is the basically parceled out destiny of the Kurdish people. When the Ottoman Empire died, Turkey hastily established its modern state. The French took its mandate north of Palestine. They drew a line. So that swath then was under the French, basically from Latakia out to the Iraq border where the English came in. And then there was Iran, which is basically another modern country which had Kurds. So the Kurds sadly were partitioned, into these zones. But Kurds are not the only population that lived there. There was a term used during the Iraq war, the Sunni Triangle. Remember this term? I hated this term. It's the stupidest term. It reduces. So I'll give you two stories. Years ago, I was reporting in Delhi, and Tariq Aziz had come to Delhi. Tariq Aziz, not Tariq Ali. Tariq Aziz was the Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq, a very sophisticated guy. He arrived in Delhi, so that was a pool interview. And we were asking him questions, and somehow it came out that he's a Christian. And I thought, this is interesting. Name is Tariq Aziz, he's a Christian. I knew Arab Christians have names that are, interesting. Anyway, then he said something, I almost fell out of my chair. He said, I'm Chaldean. I thought, my God, Chaldeans were extinct, like Nabateans, and these people appear in the Bible. I didn't realize they were Chaldeans. But when you travel in that region of Iraq, there are Chaldeans, there are Yazidis, there are, Persianate, Assyrians, there are all kinds of people. Turkmen. The town where Al-Qaeda was founded after the US occupation was Tal Afar, where Abu Musab al-Zarqawi came and founded the Islamic State of Iraq in 2006. But before that, in 2004, when he first came, late 2003, Tal Afar is not a Sunni town. It's a totally diverse town. So the Kurdish region is not Kurdish. It is completely diverse. There are all kinds of strange communities. Why? That area of Iraq particularly is valleys. And if you know anything about Eurasia, in areas where there are very difficult valleys, odd cultures develop in the valley. One valley, another valley, they are completely different cultures. Different ideas of things, pronounce things differently. You feel that in this region? You go from one area to the other and you say, wow, is this still Vermont? I feel that in America often. You go to some remote places and people's accent changes very small. Why? Because the topography creates different roots. My house is connected to that city, but not to that one. So different roots develop. I never go there, somebody says, even though it's a 20-minute drive, because I only go to this city. Different frameworks develop. So the Kurdish region is very complicated. There are more Kurds in Istanbul than any of the so-called Kurdish cities in southwest Turkey. Southeastern Turkey. Istanbul has 1 million Kurds. So Kurdish population has spread. Now, one interesting thing developed. When the uprising broke out in Syria, Bashar al-Assad did something very, very smart, strategically smart. He withdrew from the north. He concentrated on protecting Damascus and the corridor to Latakia. And he said in the north, go ahead. So at that time, the Kurdish groups, which had been a shelter for the Turkish Workers' Party, which is the United States calls it a terrorist party. It's the Marxist-Leninist Kurdish outfit from Turkey. They had taken refuge for many years in northern Syria. So the PKK fighters came into Syria and trained the Syrian Kurds in politics and in military things, and they formed a militia called the YPG. They formed a political party. This all happened after 2011. Now, this was happening while in Turkey, the Turkish government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan was in a peace negotiation with the PKK. It's called the Imrali process because their leader, Öcalan, is in the Imrali prison. So in the north of the Syrian-Turkish border, they were conducting a peace deal. In the south, the Kurds now said, we have made Rojava. We are making this province of the Kurds, Western Kurdistan, essentially. Turkey said, nothing doing. You can't make a statelet here. And that's where the contradictions emerge. So Turkey has been putting pressure to break this Rojava statelet in Syria. That restarted the war inside Turkey. And now Turkey is on the brink of total collapse. I write for a Turkish newspaper, and, I see my colleagues, people go to jail, editor get arrested. It's crazy. Press freedom in Turkey is zero. This failed coup that happened earlier has given Erdogan complete license to go. So the Kurdish experiment, I can see why it's a romantic thing for people. Books are written, socialist, feminist, whatever. It's true, they have progressive thing. But please don't overestimate that. Inside Turkey, the political party was created called the HDP. You should follow this party. Its leaders have been arrested recently. The HDP is an alliance of Kurdish nationalists and the socialist tradition, communists, all kinds of democratic socialists. They have created a great political party, very progressive party. But the Kurdish community is not a progressive community. There are many Kurdish areas and leaders who don't like the fact that the HDP is pro-gay. So, you see, this fantasy happens. We should end this. Cuba is revolution. Rojava is... People are frail and they have limitations. Don't build them up. See them for what they are. They are struggling against their own histories. They are not heroic, how you'll read about it. In Rojava, they've created a socialist paradise. Please, don't do that, because you will be sorely disappointed tomorrow. Because they are real people struggling with their real histories. They are not capable of carrying your hopes. We displace our hopes. We get Trump, we hope that they have made Rojava. You understand what I'm saying? So their histories are very complicated, just like ours. So this is a very bad tendency we have of displacement. Let them struggle, support them. But by all means, go and check out what has happened to the HDP in Turkey now. A few more? Yeah, please.
Yeah, you mentioned the Yazidi community, which is recently been infiltrated, and a lot of trauma has happened in that region to those people specifically. And I know that Western nations and organizations getting involved in that region has caused a lot of trauma and problems in the past. But if that's not the solution, then what would you suggest is?
It's a very good question. So, in the Yazidi area, in Mount Sinjar, for instance, northern Iraq, near Mosul, when ISIS took that area, they came very rapidly. You know, one thing interesting about ISIS is that they are a unity of Al-Qaeda type Salafi movement fighters, also foreign fighters, and ex-Ba'athist military officers. So one of the leaders of ISIS was Izzat al-Duri, who was the number 2 of Saddam Hussein. He had reddish hair, very interesting looking man. He looked like a pirate, you know, and I mean, he must be in his 90s now, and they say he's still alive. Every few months I read that he's dead. So it's the opposite of Henry Kissinger, you know. He's never dying, this guy keeps dying. So strange situation. But when the ISIS swept through the Yazidi area, they immediately persecuted them. Why? Because they are heathens. See, we forget all this. You know, Western journalist is killed, and I mean, I met James Foley, very nice guy. He was a graduate of UMass Amherst in the creative writing department. We met at a NATO demonstration in Chicago, anti-NATO demonstration, and then he went back to make a film. He was captured and he was killed by ISIS. But when James was killed, when Sotloff was killed, it made huge media. Meanwhile, ISIS was capturing Syrian army soldiers and then making these tapes saying the most horrible anti-Shia things as they garroted them, you know, like 20 in a row, 40 in a row. These were the YouTube videos, which the Western press didn't talk about. It's very interesting. I mean, ISIS highly sectarian. When the Yazidis were struck, they suddenly said this is a big thing. And Obama gave a speech where he said, America is on its way. Don't worry. You remember this phrase? America is on its way. Very curious phrase. When the US helicopter landed on Mount Sinjar, they were greeted by PKK fighters from Turkey. In other words, moment Sinjar was taken, columns of PKK fighters crossed from Syria and broke through ISIS ranks and were up in Mount Sinjar before Obama gave his speech saying America is on its way. You see the arrogance of this. Only America can save the day. Meanwhile, this group you are considering a terrorist organization broken through and entered Sinjar and has rescued people on the mountain. You understand what I'm saying? Because we can't imagine that they can fight their own battles. Can't imagine. It's unimaginable. America has to be there. How can they fight? They are nothing without us. Did the media come back and say this had happened? No. There was no reporting here PKK fighter. Why? I asked somebody in a major news outlet, why didn't you report? Well, it's a terrorist organization. I said, that's ridiculous. What about reality? What about reality-based reporting? You see the problem? You have to understand that there are people fighting for their lives in their own countries. They are not all asking for American bombing. Yeah, in the back.
Ever since Kim Jong-un took power in North Korea, it's sort of been a developing situation where it seems like he's continuing to exert his own control, sort of try to centralize against all of his father's generals. And there's been people talk about China sort of starting to increase pressure because he's being a lot more belligerent. People predicted North Korea would collapse over the last 20 years. I'm just sort of wondering where you see the current situation, how it's all developing.
You know Medea Benjamin of Code Pink? She's a very interesting activist. She has a new book out on Saudi Arabia. Highly recommend. Obama said, this woman is worth listening to. She heckles in the Senate all the time. Very brave. Stands up in a congressional meeting and says, you are a war criminal. And she was yelling at Obama, why are you killing people with drones? And he said, this woman is worth listening to. And that's the quote at the back of her book. I met her recently and I've known, and so I said to her, you've been to North Korea, what's it like? I want to go to North Korea. I said, what's it like? I want to experience, what is this place? What are they doing there? She said, it's very interesting, complicated society. It's people, when they go to the mausoleum, they weep. How to understand that? It's not too difficult to understand. We all have our ideological frameworks that we live with. People weep at odd things. You wept last night when you saw the election result. No family member of yours was hurt. Nobody was ill, yet you were crying. It's a political decision, but you were crying. Strange things happen in the world of politics. Some guy died in North Korea. People continue to cry at his mausoleum. But look at the difference between North Korea and Libya. If you were a leader in the world today, in some country in the world, you would say, you know what is better, more effective than anything? Nuclear weapons. You see, what's the worst proliferator in the world? Regime change. The more regime change you do, the more countries will seek nuclear weapons. It's the only insurance against regime change. Look at Libya. He gave up nuclear weapons. They were trying to build the so-called Islamic bomb from the 70s with help from Pakistan. Gave that up. He paid the British and said, sorry, we bombed you. Paid Germany, sorry, we had the disco bombing. He told the Americans, please send Al-Qaeda people, we'll torture them in your jails, including Abdul Hakim Belhaj, who's now the Emir of Tripoli. He was brought from Malaysia, tortured. He was brought by MI5 in a plane. His wife was 8 months pregnant, strapped like this from a flight from Malaysia to Tripoli, Libya. We'll torture for you. We want to make Libya into a neoliberal paradise, his son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, said. We'll call it the Kuwait on the Mediterranean. I don't know why they chose Kuwait. I myself would have chosen perhaps Dubai. Abu Dhabi maybe, Dubai, not Kuwait. Anyway, he said Kuwait on the Mediterranean. And then there's regime change against them, including sodomy of Muammar Gaddafi, and Hillary Clinton laughs. So now I'm sitting in North Korea saying, I'm never giving up my nuclear weapons. Never. Others are thinking, how do we get nuclear weapons? There are lots of bad people in the world. But there are lots of bad people with nuclear weapons that cannot be touched. And why would the Chinese like to see North Korean government fall? What is the benefit of allowing the Americans to creep up to the Yalu River? All the way, across the river. As it is, they are attacking them in the South China Sea. They don't want American bases. If North Korea unifies, it will unify to the advantage of Seoul, not to Pyongyang. Bases will come right up to the Chinese border. They don't want to see that. Why would they want to see North Korea fall? These policies are crazy. They, in fact, retain governments like North Korea. I'm not saying it should overthrow anything, but I'm just explaining that nuclear weapons plus bases right up to the border of China make North Korea's existence to perpetuity possible. Okay? What else to say to you? When I come there, you come with me. One more, there was one more, yeah.
What's your take on how the economy has to change to allow, the economy and politics to allow fighting climate change to develop, and especially with the election yesterday though?
My friend, I don't know enough about this, I'm embarrassed to say. For this, you need to bring somebody who knows about climate change, green economics and things like that. I don't know enough. I'm embarrassed to say. I read Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything. I found it very compelling, very interesting book. I learned a lot from it. But I don't know enough to answer your question. So let's take another one. Yeah. Oh, again?
Yeah.
What about her, and then I'll come back to you. Yeah, please. Well, 1, 2, and then 3. 1, yeah.
I was just wondering what your take is on how how the United States should be dealing with ISIS, especially now based on what's happening in Mosul and like the humanitarian crisis that's on its way.
See, so there are two cities that are being taken now. One is Aleppo, one is Mosul. Both are in great tragedy. The speed in Aleppo may decrease a little bit. You know, the Syrian regime has been trying to get this over with before Hillary Clinton becomes president. Now that Trump is going to be the president, they are not in a hurry anymore. I think they'll slow down the assault in Aleppo. They've been sitting at Aleppo airport for over a year, waiting to have the assault. Aleppo is a divided city. So the pace of the attack was so severe, the civilian casualties were horrible. It was outrageous, the number of people being killed, because they went so fast, because they wanted to get it. They had a timetable. Timetable opened for two reasons. One is the Turks suddenly said they have switched, becoming more sympathetic to Russia. They closed support to their proxies inside Aleppo, like Arara, Sham and other groups. They closed their support to them. That happened. And then the election timetable, the Syrian army went in very hard. So it's very tragic, but now I think they will probably slow down, because the speed is no longer necessary. I don't know. I'm just saying. Big humanitarian problem, Aleppo. But Mosul and Raqqa, even greater humanitarian challenge. Because much bigger population. Aleppo is a divided city and has been divided for now 3 years. More than 3 years, 4 years. Okay, so people understand how to come in and take care of others. You know what I mean? There's still a space. Mosul has been isolated for the last 2 years. There are upwards over 1 million people sitting there. And the attack has been quite severe. They're still outside Mosul, just moving. Once it gets in, it's going to be horrible. So now your question is a correct question. I mean, what is ISIS? ISIS is foreign fighters on the one side, and then ISIS is people from the region who have great grievances. And there are two kinds of grievances that are available. One is the grievance against the order that has been established, highly sectarian order. I go into this here about the sectarian constitution pushed by the United States and these exiles, like the people from the Dawa party, that create a very sectarian Iraq. Iraq has a great history of cosmopolitanism. Brutal, whatever, fine. But also openness was there. That has been compromised after the 2003 collapse of the state. So there has to be some concession against this sectarianism. That has to be there, very important. But secondly, we also have to take a step back and recognize this is 60, 70 years of history that has to be undone. I go into this at length, so I don't want to tell you too much, but just to very quickly, in the 1960s, the United States and Saudi Arabia came to an understanding that the way to fight the communists in the region, Iraq had the largest communist party in West Asia and could have conducted a revolution after the 1958 revolution. They were the most powerful political force in Iraq. So to combat the communists and to combat the secular nationalists, Nasserites, Baathists, etc., the United States egged the Saudis. They worked together to finance a group called the World Muslim League. And this group went in using later vast petrodollars, oil money, vast funds to go in and produce schooling and send in preachers. So in rural parts of Iraq and in Syria, especially after 2003, large numbers of Saudi preachers have been around. It's interesting when you look at the rebellion in Syria, in Aleppo, in the suburbs of Damascus, in other parts, many of the sheikhs, the religious leaders of these rebel groups are Saudi or have had Saudi education. It's very interesting. Jaish al-Islam, the group that was fighting in Douma, the suburb of Damascus, was openly a Saudi-backed proxy. But even the groups in Aleppo, many of them in rural Aleppo, outside Aleppo, in the rural area, in the great Syrian desert, the Hamad region, many of them had been trained by Saudi preachers or Saudi-trained preachers. And this has had an impact, ideological impact on people's thinking. So this is a very long-term project. You can't bomb this out of people's brains. You have participated in creating this as a lever against secular nationalism and communism, we're going to have to live with this now. It's going to take a long time. And meanwhile, the US continues to have an alliance with Saudi Arabia. You know, you can't have it all ways. You can't create something and say, oh my God, how do we get rid of it? You are continuing to create it. You're continuing to facilitate the Saudi agenda. United States, whether it's a tail wagging the dog, is certainly riding an Israeli and Saudi tiger. And, you know, unless you decide whether you're guiding the tiger or being driven by it, that's immaterial. You have to fight to get off the tiger. Yeah. Yeah.
My question is about the UN and the non-aligned movement, and you were mentioning how in the 60s, 70s they were able to garner some sort of power. What facilitated that, and what facilitated them losing that power?
Well, it's a great question, but my answer is going to be again shorthand. What allowed them to have that kind of power was that they rode the crest of the anti-colonial movements. You know, I wrote a book about this called The Darker Nations, which tells the history of this appearance of these countries on the world stage. You know, again, they're not necessarily regimes that one would like. That's not the point. The point is, what is their role in world history? And their role at the time was they carried the mantle of anti-colonialism, brought it to the United Nations, and fought for a certain agenda. See, one mystification that we often hear is that the values of liberalism in the UN were enshrined by the West. You forget that the Charter of Human Rights in 1948, the people who insisted on many of the core provisions were women who were delegates from the Dominican Republic. You know, because most of the world was still colonized. So these women delegates from the DR, from I think Colombia was one. They were the ones who came to the San Francisco meeting and insisted on some of these provisions. The history we tell is it's Eleanor Roosevelt, because it's got to be an American. We forget, we just erase these women, you know, from world history, from their role in world history. How it dies is the debt crisis. There's no question that the enforced debt crisis that takes place when the United States government decides to lift interest rates, the so-called Volcker shock. That Volcker shock in 1979 suddenly raised what is known as the London Interbank Borrowing Rate, LIBOR. The London Interbank Offer Rate, London Interbank Offer Rate. LIBOR rates skyrocketed. So even though these countries had the same loans, when LIBOR went up, their debt servicing payments went up. So in the 1980s, they slid into this third world debt crisis. And that just weakened their ability to bargain. So many of them came to the IMF, they had to beg for better terms, and their political power depleted in that. You know, I remember in 1983 at the NAM meeting, non-aligned meeting in New Delhi, Fidel Castro gave perhaps the best speech of his career, where he said we should stop paying our debt servicing. We should create a debtors union as countries, and we should fight together to renegotiate our debts. It's not our fault we're in debt. We're in debt because the world financial system has screwed us. And he got a standing ovation and nobody listened to him. Typical, Fidel got this a lot. He wanted to politicize something which should have been political. But they said, no, it's a technical matter. We have to deal with it in the London group of negotiations, Paris group of negotiations, IMF, World Bank, etc. Can't make it political. He said, you people are crazy. This is precisely political. The world financial system is screwing us. We need to have an alternative. They said no. One last question is a good idea? Yes, please.
From the US, I'm actually Nigerian, and something that's happening in a lot of parts of Africa is that we're developing very fast. And there are a lot of countries that are now in parts of Nigeria, for example, like the Chinese is now really big there. So I was wondering, what do you think the role of a lot of countries in Africa are in this world of militarization, because there are not that many African countries that are militarized?
So a big question you asked. I mean, look, Africa's last 200 years have been a history that people should study. Let's take the case of the Congo. I mean, I was very happy when Adam Hochschild wrote his book called King Leopold's Ghost. I really recommend this book, King Leopold's Ghost, about the brutality, Belgian brutality in the Congo. And the reason I'm saying this is that there is a long history to understand the situation in African countries. Second period to bear in mind is that every time independent African movements appeared, they had to be crushed. From Lumumba 1961 to my great hero Thomas Sankara 1983. Sankara was killed in 1987, and his movement in Burkina Faso was basically executed by Compaoré and the thugs in the French Foreign Ministry and the World Bank, IMF. They hated Sankara. Sankara used to come to the UN and give speeches about the need to fight the debt crisis. I mean, I can't explain to you what a person this meant for me personally. To read Sankara, watch Sankara speak. He spoke for Africa that was constantly denied by violence. Every time they rose up, they were crushed. And Sankara was not an individual. He was the front of a major movement to change the colonial name Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, gave it a name of dignity, and then said, we are proud people and we will build our own societies. Crushed, assassinated. So now we come to a situation, again rebalancing. Suddenly the Chinese are players in the scene. And what do we have? So now the West says Chinese are colonial. I think this is very interesting. I'm surprised about this. Suddenly the Chinese are colonial. Okay. You have this long history, King Leopold, pleased to meet you, Livingston, an American showing the way where to destroy things. That is Stanley, so-called journalist, basically imperialist himself. You have the partition, dividing of Africa, etc., etc., etc. You have the wars recently in the Great Lakes region. Okay, this, that. You have American evangelical preachers going to East Africa and telling people, what is AIDS? It's a scourge against, this infamy of homosexuality. These are American preachers, wanting to take their agenda to Africa. I mean, what do we have? We have a situation now where the Chinese are showing up and they are bargaining and bidding. This is pure capitalism. They are saying, this is the deal we'll offer you. Now, I'm against the extraction and theft of resources anywhere, whether it's by colonialism or capitalism. That's still theft of resources. But they are not doing anything illegal. They are competing with the West. There has to be another agenda. There is no third agenda. Again, we are back to rebalancing. They are competing in Africa for resources. Saudis are there in Ethiopia, buying land by the hundreds of acres, hectares, right? We need a different project. People need to imagine, where is the Sankara, where is the movement to produce today's Sankara? I'm not saying, Rojava thing. I'm saying 4 places like Central Africa or East Africa. Where is the alternative? When the leader of Tanzania, who was a student of Julius Nyerere, meaning he was his junior, becomes basically, a World Bank guy, IMF guy, where is the alternative? We need to be bold and articulate alternatives. It's like the Democratic Party here, and this is a good way for me to end. You can't fight an election saying the other person is bad. You can't fight an election where people have no jobs and say, be scared of him, vote for me. What are you offering people? If you don't have a vision for the future, you don't deserve to win an election. You have to have a vision. What's the alternative to what American multinational firms or Chinese multinational, what's the alternative to what they are doing? How can we imagine what the wealth of, say, Central Africa should produce? Do we have an alternative vision? We need that. That's our task now, is to try to articulate hundreds of alternative visions. To be afraid is the worst reaction. This is the moment to be bold and say we reject the politics of vacuum, idea vacuum. We reject the politics of brainlessness. We want politics of impassioned ideas. We want people to be able to dream about something. We want to create slogans where people who are feeling desperate feel hopeful. That's what our task is. Our task isn't to merely cut things down, right? So it's not our position to say what should happen in this country, that country, but we should collaborate with people to think and use our expertise, come up with solutions. So that's got to be our takeaway from our moment. It's not to crawl up inside the shell and pretend that the world is going to change by the time I pop my head out of my turtle shell. That's not the attitude. Attitude is to be vigilant, alert, look for alternatives, and then articulate the alternatives. Only we can articulate real alternatives. The danger of these kind of political figures is they can assess the problem, but they don't have a solution. It's up to you to come up with a solution. Thanks a lot.